Several weeks ago, I did a video working on this cedar planter over here. Today, we're building this one. However, this is not a video about the build process, but instead about building the build process. Welcome everybody, I'm Jason, the creator of the Tabletop Battlefield, and why not dive back into the whole topic of efficient woodworking, project management? Why not? Because I enjoy that kind of stuff. I know, I'm strange. But when you're setting up a workflow for a project, especially if it's something you want to do multiple times or build multiple of them, there are a few important things to think about as you're planning this process out. Now, first and foremost, the order of the steps is definitely important. Now, there's a couple things to consider here, because obviously this big picture thing is like with the cedar planter, before I can build the sides, I have to cut all the side planks. So there's obvious things like that. But sometimes you have a choice, right? You can do step A first or step B first. Maybe doing step A first to make the whole process faster, but that may come with, say, a cost of quality, or if you're trying to factor in a business cost in terms of making money off these things, maybe one's going to cost more than the other in terms of supplies, in terms of something else. So there are other details you have to consider. From a materials cost, I've also done something quite a bit different. I'm going to be using these guys over here. These are 6-foot cedar fence posts versus appearance boards like I got here on my other hand. Now, the previous planter was made from these nicer boards, and the difference is a cost of about 3 times. Making this thing out of these cedar fence posts, it's probably going to cost a planter around a little over 50 bucks. With these boards, you're looking at well over 150. The difference is, of course, the appearance boards look a lot nicer on the outside compared to these things. These are kind of like the crappy 2x4s of the cedar world. So the downside is, if you want to get that nice look, it's going to be more human labor, or if you just want the nice rustic look, which would be an option if I were to actually be manufacturing these, I can just reduce the overall price because my material costs are 1/3 or about 1/3 because there's still glue and screws and things like that, but And the other frustrating part about this is that sometimes what is obvious in terms of what needs to be done first isn't actually obvious. So let's take a look at a picture of the planter that I built this time around. And you can see towards the bottom they got this nice little chamfered panel that kind of sits between the legs and kind of hides the gap between the board and the bottom, and then the wall panels on top. The thing is, on the back, it's not chamfered. Why is that? Because I thought it'd be a good idea to screw that thing on first and then apply the chamfering later. However, what I discovered is I actually put the screws too close to the edge, and when I went to use the router to do the chamfered bit, there's a lot of sparks flying. And that's not a good thing, unless it's robot combat, which it's not. Just realize that you gotta have to go back, reevaluate things when you go through it the first time. I know it's annoying, and I had this nice little battle plan set out, but things didn't go quite as well as expected. Oops. The other thing to think about is you got to approach this like an assembly line, even if the reality is you're the only person who's going to be working on it. And I try to do that with this project. You'll see in a moment here I talk about these Bessie clamps and how they're kind of like my one limiting factor in this whole process. But the thing to remember when you're designing out an assembly line is the whole thing can only move as fast as the slowest step. Now, it's an interesting little example. If you were to kind of break down an automobile assembly line, what you might see is certain steps are actually repeated. So for example, welding the body or welding the frame of the car might have 3 or 4 different steps along the assembly line, even though they're all basically the same thing, and because of that, you've got to have multiple sets of equipment, multiple employees if that's required, whatever it may be. The reason for that is, let's say the entire welding process of a car takes an hour, but all the other steps in the assembly line take 15 to 20 minutes. Well, what happens then, the entire assembly line would stop for an hour while the welding is done, everything else would get done in 15-20 minutes, and then there'd be 40 minutes of effective downtime across most of the line. So therefore, even though everything can move really fast, this one long station is holding up the entire process. So if you break that assembly of the welding down into 4 steps that are each 15 minutes long, now you have 4 segments that are all about the same length as everything else in the process of the car, and you got much less downtime in terms of waiting for various steps to complete. So when it comes to this build process, my big limiting factor are these things right here, these Bessey parallel clamps that I use to glue up basically a large portion of the pieces of the planter. So my entire workflow that I've approximately got sketched down this sheet of paper over here, this is all based around the idea that I'm going to be using these things nearly constantly and swapping out the pieces that are being glued up every 30 minutes and in some cases 20 minutes, depending on what piece it actually is. That should be enough to get the pieces to set, blah, blah, blah. No, that's not going to work. More on that later. And then therefore, I'm filling in the times around those 30-minute blocks to get more things ready for more glue up, or if necessary, work on things that don't need to be glued up using the parallel clamps if all those steps are done first. So what went wrong with gluing up panels, as I kind of hinted there with a little dropped-in video. So in that particular discussion, I talked about how the idea was to have 30 minutes, maybe even 20 minutes of gluing up on these clamps because I only had the one set of clamps. Well, that's definitely not enough time. Not enough at all. Maybe for the small size of the planter, which are 4 things wide, that might be enough at 30 minutes, just barely, because that's about enough to get a little bit of a hold to where you can pick up the thing and move it off. But the 8-panel sides, the long sides, 30 minutes of gluing time is not enough to support all those pieces being glued together and be able to move them off the clamp. The reality is you're probably looking at 60, 70, 80 minutes of drying time on the clamp for the longer sides. So how do you handle that? Well, there's a couple things you could do. You could factor in the fact you do have 80 minutes of drying time and redesign your product. You'll see that in a moment. Alternatively, the easy solution, especially if you're trying to go for a business solution where you want to sell stuff, buy more clamps. Now those Bessey clamps are not cheap. They're about $50 a piece. So a pair is $100, and if you really want to get fancy, you probably should get 3, maybe even 4 of those clamps per panel. But at the end of the day, you're just throwing a few $100 more at something, which in theory, if you're running a business, you can make that back up pretty quickly. So that's your alternative solution. But let's take a look at the redesign part right now. I got some more cedar fence pickets, and I've got a new battle plan here to make a new, hopefully smaller and faster raised planter. So let's go ahead and do that right now with the fastest build montage video I've ever done. And there you go, all done. Let me look at some quick numbers here, and I can actually dive back up the studio for final analysis. But with this particular set right here, let's see, cost was about $15 in materials. That's pretty nice. And about 3 hours of labor. Now that included me doing some filming, and I did screw up something pretty bad at one point. So, you know, this one is definitely cheaper to manufacture, both in materials and time. Whether I can make a profit on it, well, we'll have to figure that out in the future. So the little mini one I just showed you there, same kind of ideas are being applied there at the mini guy as well as the full-size planter. Of course, the mini guy is a lot smaller. It's like about 3 feet by 6 inches versus, I don't know, a little bit less than 4 feet by a little bit less than 2 feet. But how that in particular uses a lot fewer clamps per se, at least clamp minutes, is there's only 2 things that have to be glued up using the clamps. You have the sides that have 6 panels, and that's it. Whereas in the full-size planter, you've got the long sides, the short sides, so there's 4 right there, and then each of those panels that run along the bottom of the walls, those have to be glued up with the Bessey clamps as well, so or some sort of parallel clamp. You could probably use a smaller one there, but once again, more clamps. So the big full-size planter at a minimum has about 8 glue-up processes with the parallel clamps versus 2 with a smaller one. With this little small one that I'll show you a picture of right now, one thing I did was along the bottom where I had the floorboards attached to the walls, I only put one screw in each of the wall panels. And what has happened in the few weeks that's been sitting outside is the cedar panels are starting to cup. They're cupping outwards. So the screw is in the middle of the panel, but the sides are coming outwards a little bit separated from the actual floorboard, which is creating little bits of gaps along the bottom. It's not really a serious issue. Nothing's fallen out of there, but it is reducing the overall integrity and appearance of the particular piece. So probably what I'd have to do to evaluate that design is go back and add some sort of side support like the big ones have, even though it's not necessarily serving the same function where you've got trying to hide a seam. It'll still look nice and add a little bit more structural support to the entire piece. Now let me give you some actual numbers on how long each of them took to build. Alright, well here is the sheet of notes on the big one. I got all my little build sessions up here in the corner, and if I add them up, it comes out to a little bit over or about 8 hours of build time. Now keep in mind that there was some screw-ups involved because I tried to rush the glue-up process, and of course there was filming involved. So I imagine I could probably cut off maybe an hour, maybe 2 from all those things. So you know, I could start with a number of say 6 hours of labor if I wanted to factor in you know, how much this would cost for me to build and sell to somebody. And I think the total cost came out to be about $50 in wood. You'd have to factor in almost an entire box of exterior screws, which is about £1, so that's about $10, maybe a little bit less because it wasn't a full box. I want to say it's around 12 ounces of the waterproof glue. I have to do the math on that. But, you know, you're probably looking at around $75 in materials for the big one. With 6 hours of labor, I mean, you know, it's... I mean, that's probably looking at like a $400 price point if I were to sell that. And I still wanted to have enough profit left over later on, assuming I was running the business of this. Details. Because you need to factor in time that you spend doing non-business things that are not generating revenue when you're building product on a per hour basis. So let me put that guy to the side. Here's a little guy's sheet. This one, like I said, went about 3 hours, and that factored in a little bit of camera work and probably a few screw-ups. There always is the first time you do it. So I don't know. I might be able to get it down to 2 hours, but that's kind of maybe I would change a few designs a little bit. The legs are a little bit complex. One doesn't work very well because it's got a knot in it. Actually got to fix that before it falls over on itself. I'm dead serious. One of the legs, they're tapered, and it has a knot right in the middle here because the cedar fence posts are not, you know, like I said, the other crappy 2x4s of the cedar world. And that knot, the legs kind of breaking at the knot, so it's holding together by sheer weight, but that's about it. So that's why I got to fix that. Because I had to move that planter a few days ago to get a little more sun to the plants. Yeah, it almost fell over. Oops. But what I might do is not cut those tapered legs because they're unless you have a better way of doing it, there's other jigs and tools and jigsaw and stuff like that. Just details. Okay, I think that's really about it in terms of talking about the workflow process of these guys and what things I took into consideration when I went ahead and built them that way. Actually, you know, one more little thing while I'm thinking of it. In terms of saving time and accuracy, just one last, we'll call it a bonus tip because I didn't put it down in my notes, I just remembered it now. So a bonus tip. It's often a good idea that you make all the same operations with the tool when it's in a set shape. So you're not basically adjusting a particular tool to go between different types of cuts, because every time you adjust a tool to do a different cut, you have a chance of introducing a bit of an error into, say, a length of a board or something like that. This is especially true with a miter saw. With that monster, you know, miter saw thing that I love to use so much, it's a good idea to measure once and cut all the wall panels are the exact same length all at one time. That way, even if you kind of mess up that cut a little bit, where instead of being, I think it's 11 1/4 inches on most of these pieces, you end up making it like 11 3/8 or something, or 11 1/8. they're all going to be basically the same mistake, and it's not going to matter in the long run because, well, they're going to still be the same length in the end. So there's a free bonus tip for you. Yeah, that's probably about it. So I guess if you guys got any questions about how to do this workflows, feel free to put in the show notes. Wait, not the show notes. Put it in the comments. The show notes are right here. Literally, they're down below the video if there's anything, and they're actually sitting on my desk right now. So once again, I'm Jason. Go ahead and hit subscribe, like, all that silly stuff for more woodworking videos, or tabletop game videos, or robot videos, or I don't know. I've been playing Command & Conquer Remastered. It's been driving me up the wall. I don't remember the game being that freaking hard. But I really don't. I must have played it easy when I was a kid. I guess that's probably what happened. But yes. So with all of that out of the way, thanks for watching, and have a great week.